Welcome, everyone on the information superhighway. This looks and feels a little bit weird, I'm going to be honest, because it's just such a far departure from the last time I podcasted, which feels like the very early ages of podcasting. It was definitely during hardline, like cable internet. It wasn't like dial-up or 56K, but it certainly feels weird. I'm on camera now. Hi, everybody. And I'm also really doing this in an awesome Riverside.fm interface that allows me to really tailor this podcasting experience to the goal I'm trying to accomplish, which is helping you, the listener, and your families in your recruiting process. So let's start there. My name is Jared Zeidman. Welcome to another fun multimedium of my Nail the Recruiting Process project. I think it's important to start by letting you all know how we got to this project in the first place. So back in the day, I graduated from undergrad in 2008. I thought I was going to be a sports broadcaster. That was the thing I was most passionate about at that time. But I also really started to get into the back end inner workings of higher education. So I ran this sports blog called takeoverthegame.com, and my focus in that sports blog was sports reform, especially the immediate and long-term future of intercollegiate athletics, because during this time, a lot of different things were happening, but it was all centered around the financing of college athletics. Conferences were changing. The debate about compensating athletes, at least with their name, image, and likeness rights, was really, really gaining steam. And I had the opportunity to write about and work with a lot of really cool athletes. And then it kind of snowballed into this podcast called The Armchair Athletic Directors. And The Armchair Athletic Directors was a awesome podcast that was co-hosted by my buddy Josh Fullader. And we got to interview major figures in this reform movement. This included journalists like Dan Wetzel, authors like Taylor Branch, a Pulitzer Prize winning author, came on my podcast, which was crazy at the time, especially because podcasting looked nothing like this. Then we got amazing sports personalities. The headliner was Jay Billis, who was a repeat guest and was amazing to us and super generous with his time. And then finally, we got to hear from major speakers in the movement, authors like John Gurdy and Andrew Zimbalist, and the president of the National College Players Association, who's really the front runner of a lot of these legal challenges in reform, Ramogi Huma. And this set me up to really understand the language of equity from an athlete's perspective. And it was so cool to learn about all that stuff. But then I actually got back into coaching, and I fell back in love with coaching. I quit my administrative job in college after getting my master's degree, and I decided to really double down on coaching and working with athletes because that was the thing I was most in love with. So I thought it was going to be a conflict of interest to have this reform podcast going on while I was actually coaching at the collegiate level. Plus, running this website, this blog, and this podcast was taking a lot of time. So I coach, I dive in, I'm 2 feet in. That's kind of how I like to operate. And I go from volunteer assistant coaching to being the associate head coach of a Division III program at Union College, where I was basically acting in the capacity of the head coach for my last 3 years there. I was under the supervision of Mary Ellen Burt, who was, I think she still is, the winningest coach in any sport in the history of Union College. And she was an amazing mentor that really challenged me to grow every day and really think about the organization and the program first. Flash forward a little bit more. I leave that position after I don't become the full-time head coach at Union College. I become a first assistant, at the Division I program, Canisius University. I have the opportunity to work under Sahar Nusseibeh, and I'm very excited. You will be hearing, listeners, from Sahar Nusseibeh in the near future, but she was an incredible boss. She is a rising star in the Division I women's college basketball world, and she was tasked with rebuilding Canisius College women's basketball as it was transitioning from Canisius College to Canisius University. I was thrilled to be on that staff, thrilled to be able to make an impact. It was gratifying in a million different ways. Not only the relationships with the players and the development of the players and successfully rebuilding the program, but also the personal validation of someone who had been on this journey and changed careers and really was making a positive impact at a level where, prior to jumping into D1, you don't know if you could do it or not. You just sort of show up and see how it goes, and it was going well. Here's the twist. I got COVID for the first time in the spring of 2022, and about 6 weeks after getting COVID, started having really significant problems. Just with the way that my heart rate was functioning, the way my blood pressure was functioning. I was having some really interesting neurological symptoms that made working difficult. And basically, it went from something I was trying to work through to about 3 or 4 months later, not being able to work through it. And after being really stubborn and trying to continue kind of soldiering it out and coach through a season, there just became a lot more knowledge about what COVID was doing to people, excuse me. And I got with more doctors who basically were like, you really shouldn't be coaching right now. So in the spring of 2023, I stepped away from coaching indefinitely. Unfortunately, I am still waiting to be cleared to return to full-time work. For anyone that knows me, they know I'm kind of a workaholic, so it's been very challenging to sit around at home without doing something productive. And that is where this recruiting journey sort of comes in. I was extremely fortunate to be networked with some incredible AAU coaches who I had good recruiting experiences with in the past. And they had some young female athletes who needed some guidance in the recruiting process. And I had no idea how to navigate them, but I knew how I liked to recruit. And I had a sense of what college coaches were looking for and how to maybe address some misunderstandings in the process. And these two young ladies kind of worked with me on a pilot basis, and they both ended up at a dream school. One is a Division I scholarship athlete, and one is going to be playing at one of the top Division III colleges in the country. And I am so excited for both of them. But I also had a really unique experience with both of them in that they and their parents both had really consistent questions about parts of the process. Parts of the process that I would describe as pain points for a typical recruit and their family. What does outreach to a coach need to look like or sound like? What parts of my performance are really being evaluated? What are the things that coaches actually care about versus what they don't really care about at all? And I had this time on my hands where I couldn't really work, and I could work in, kind of small increments to get small projects done, but I couldn't work full time. And I thought to myself, why don't we do some research here and try to act almost as a journalist on the behalf of recruits and their families? So this allows me to put basically every hat I've ever worn prior to this point in my life on at the exact same time. I'm kind of a sports broadcasting journalist representing or trying to be a purveyor of truth, if you will, for high school athletes and their parents. But I'm also trying to dispel some myths about what college coaches actually want, what they sort of look for. So I go out, and here's what this project looks like. I survey 50 college coaches. Of those 50 college coaches, I do sit-down interviews, long form, with 15 of them. Then I go back to all my mentors and all my people with this data, and I'm kind of like, help me make sense of this. And as I start getting the data is crazy. And it's not like this typical political data where, think about any major issue in America where a huge chunk of people are pro-life, a huge chunk of people are pro-choice. And now I obviously have my own opinions on that, but it doesn't change the fact that there are huge clusters of people that feel in a very polarized way about that issue. That is not how this data looked. All of the college coaches were like a hive mind. They all sort of responded the same way to every question, and it kind of validated me because it made me think about the recruiting process differently. It made me kind of be like, well, maybe I'm not crazy that I was doing it this way. It turns out we're either all crazy or we're all thinking the exact same way. And I really think that young people and their families need to know how we're thinking. Then I started reaching out to coaches who I didn't really know as well, and I got them to give me their take on the data. And when they responded in interesting ways, I'd follow up with them. And that's what really got my gears turning a little bit more. I was hearing the same thing from so many different coaches that I started thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. If all these coaches are saying the exact same thing, How come some coaches are better than others? What's really like separating us in the college community? So I started reaching out to some of my favorite athletes that I coached and some of the new athletes that transferred in to our program at Canisius. And I was thinking to myself, if you transferred, it must be because something went wrong in your initial experience. So why don't I share this data I have with you? And why don't you give me your thoughts? And that's when this really picked up steam. And I realized I was onto something. There were areas where the players really agreed with the coaches. We'll talk about that more in a second. There were other areas where the players really challenged the coaches and their consistency, how often the coaches actually lived out the things they sold in their recruiting process. We'll also talk about that more in a second. But it really got my gears turning more on a long-term project. That project for me was threefold. Putting out a book about the recruiting process was part one, which I've already done. Being more active on social media, kind of as that purveyor and journalist about how the recruiting process actually works and how to navigate it from every angle, not just being a defendant for coaches, because I was learning in real time, some of these coaches are getting this stuff wrong. That's part two. Part three, that's where we are right now. A podcast that is going to regularly educate players and parents on how to best navigate the recruiting process as they go along. So as we think about this, there are three specific things that I want to bring to your attention. We're going to talk about all three of these things in depth right now in the first official episode of this podcast. We're flying solo for this one. No guest interviews today, because the thing that has to come first is that table setting data that better explains why we are where we are. So as I look at my notes here, sorry, part of the COVID stuff is that my brain doesn't remember the way it used to remember. So I am going off some notes here. Here are the three things that are going to be kind of outlining everything that we talk about. These are the three biggest challenges in the modern recruiting process. Challenge one. I've learned that there is a massive, massive disconnect between what high school athletes and their parents think college coaches are looking for and what they think college athletics are actually about day to day, and what college coaches actually think college athletics is about day to day. So what college coaches are looking for very rarely lines up with what the uninformed player or parent actually thinks they're looking for. That's problem one. Problem two, there are substantial issues in college coaching. This podcast does not exist to exonerate college coaches from these issues. In fact, one of the people that I interviewed in my research is a coach with multiple Final Four experiences on their resume who told me, and I'm quoting, "You cannot embark on this project if you are not prepared to talk about crappy coaches." So we are going to talk about crappy coaches. And then problem three, the current landscape of college athletics is changing rapidly. There's a lot happening, and we're going to talk about some of it later today on this podcast. But what's most important is that the group of people that are suffering the most consequences, in short form, the people paying for it the most, are current generation high school athletes and the next generation of high school athletes. It has never been more challenging to obtain a roster spot offer to play at the collegiate level at the school of your dreams. And because of how challenging it is, and because of these new challenges that are right around the corner, we're going to talk about something called the recruiting pendulum. We're going to talk about what it's going to look like when that pendulum swings back and what you as a recruit and a family need to do to best navigate this new generation of the recruiting process. So we're going to start with part one, which is that information disconnect. There's a lot of different ways I can set the table here, but the most important way that I think I can set the table for you is by sharing, to me, the most surprising piece of data in my research. I asked 50 college coaches on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you think the typical athlete you are recruiting actually gets college basketball? How much do you think they actually understand what's going on day to day? I shouldn't actually even just say college basketball. It was college everything. It was college sports in general. If they answered a 1, it would be the kids totally don't get it at all. If they answered a 10, it would have meant they completely have it, they're ready, there's no adjustment phase whatsoever. The average response from 50 college coaches was a 3.5 out of 10. Now, here's something a little bit crazier about that data. It was almost a 50-50 split between D1 and non-D1 coaches that participated. So I wanted to have heavy representation from the scholarship level, but I also wanted to have a heavy representation from the non-scholarship level, especially after coaching at the D3 level myself and seeing what the recruiting process was like. So even though that split you might think would lead to a disconnect in that information, there was no statistical difference between how a scholarship level coach responded and how a non-scholarship level coach responded. So across the board, college coaches feel like current high school athletes are not being adequately prepared for the college athletics experience. To supplement that quote unquote, do they get it data, there's a couple specific things that I really want you to think about. There's a lot of fear-based marketing when it comes to high school athletics. You have to be trained by an elite trainer. You have to play for an elite AAU program. You have to have the most minutes on the best high school team you can find. When you get down to what college coaches actually think about that type of stuff, none of it really matters to them. There is no significant preference that you play for the best AAU team. There is less even of a preference that you play for an elite high school team. Another crazy piece of data, there is no preference whatsoever that you are a single sport athlete. In fact, 49 out of the 50 coaches that I interviewed said they do not care at all if you exclusively focus on one sport in high school. I can tell you my first recruiting class at the Division I level contained 3 athletes that had all-star recognition in other sports besides basketball to drive that point home. But that really flies in the face of a lot of what you're probably hearing if you're going through this journey. So what actually matters? Couple things. Thing one, the thing that matters most when you're being evaluated for talent by a college basketball coach is your efficiency when you are playing against similarly skilled opponents. So let's say you want to be a Division I athlete. Then the most important thing is that a college coach sees you competing well and holding your own against other athletes that aspire to play Division I. And that's really something that drives disconnect, because I interact with a lot of people who are all county or all region in a specific area, and they think that's enough to get them a scholarship. But every region is different, and college coaches know that. So if you're playing great ball, but you're in a region where the kind of competition in your region is a little bit weaker than another region, that's when you're going to need to find an AAU team to compete against similarly skilled people. Maybe you're in a region where there isn't great AAU ball, but you happen to play in an awesome high school region against great competition. Then that's how a coach will find you. If neither of those things are really applicable to you, then you have to take your games when you do play against similarly skilled competition and get them on film and get them to get them to college coaches. That's you engaging with the college coaches, you sending your film, you taking the initiative in that first step to build that relationship. So right off the rip, this is not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's a college coach's job to find you. But the way that they assess talent is not just by reading your stats or seeing your best game, especially if they can't really control for what your competition looks like. So that's piece one of the misunderstanding. Piece two of the misunderstanding is that college coaches are not just evaluating your talent. They're evaluating essentially a projection of your ability to take their coaching and continue growing at the collegiate level. So if a college coach meets you as a first year in high school or watches you play for the first time when you're a first year in high school, and then by the time you're a senior in high school, you haven't really grown as a player or a leader, then their analysis of you is that they don't see you growing under their tutelage. In short, your attitude matters about a gajillion times more than you think it does. In fact, coaches were more likely to make recruiting decisions, specifically a decision from a yes to a no, based on the attitude components that we discussed versus the talent components that we discussed. Now, why is that? I can tell you myself. Coaches learn as they go through their development. When they're younger, they might take a chance on a kid with a tough attitude, on a kid with over-involved parents. But you only need to get burned by that once to be like, oh, that wasn't good, and now I'm never going to do it again. And one of the things I've really learned in dealing with my colleagues is there's a very big difference between what a younger coach in their mid-20s looks for in the recruiting process and what a more seasoned veteran coach in their mid-30s and beyond looks for in the recruiting process. Because the mid-20s coach thinks to themselves, oh, that kid has a bad attitude, but I'm a good enough coach. I can manage that. And a veteran coach realizes that being a good coach is also understanding your own limitations. And you as an individual do not have the power to take every kid with a bad attitude and make them all of a sudden the best attitude kid in the world. You can change incrementally, but development is more like polishing. It's not like transforming. So when we're on the road, we are evaluating people on their attitudes because we know how hard it is to change someone's attitude once they arrive on a college campus. The way I want you to visualize this process is by visualizing a quadrant. And what I want you to understand is that when coaches recruit, now this is a bit of an oversimplification, but when they recruit, they're trying to check off different parts of a quadrant. Your talent is on one isolated part of the quadrant. Say it's the top left. On the top right, that's going to be like your size, your speed, your athleticism. Now, why are those two things separate? Because I've seen some elite scorers that did not have the size or the speed or the athleticism to be able to get their shots off at the Division I level. There are still great homes for them at Division II or Division III schools or USCA schools or NAIA schools or JUCO schools. There's great basketball being played everywhere. But the size, speed, and athleticism is a differentiator aside from talent. Your basketball IQ also really matters, because what if you're a coach that needs to replace a really high IQ player that was pivotal, to keeping the ball moving on your team? That matters. But the other parts of the quadrant, your resilience is one corner. When things go wrong, what are you still contributing to your team? When you're not making any shots, what does your game look like? Are you still making a positive net impact on the game when you're not doing the thing that you are best at? And then finally, your overall attitude. What does your engagement level look like? What does your awareness level look like? Are you coachable? When you get pulled out of the game, are you pouting by yourself, kind of swigging water and you can't be bothered? Or are you just as locked in on what's going on in the game when you're on the bench as you are when you're on the court? Those things are all being evaluated the same way. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I've seen some kids with not great attitudes get offers and, end up playing at a certain level. And you're probably right. But my question to you would be, is there a whole full team of that kid? And since the answer is no, then we move on to what the standard recruiting process looks like, which is that you need to grow not only your game and your talent on the court, but you need to grow your attitude and you need to grow your effort. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that growth down the line when we talk about gear a little bit later in the podcast. But now let's talk about part two. Let's say that you do all of these things right and you start getting noticed by coaches. And maybe you're lucky enough to start getting offers to some of the schools of your dreams. I need you to learn from the generations of athletes that came before you. And I'm very excited that we're going to have some of these athletes on this podcast because they are going to tell you the same thing that I'm going to tell you right now, which is that not every offer is created equal and not every coach can actually provide you the substance of what they're selling you in the recruiting process. I'm going to use a very interesting example. And for a moment, this example will probably appeal more to the parents than it will the athletes, but parents, it's mission critical. that you share this with your kids. Most major businesses have a sales team, and their job is to give you information about the product. Their job is to persuade you about the product. Their job is to convince you ultimately that their product is best. And by the way, most of these people truly believe their product is the best. That's why they're good salespeople. But you might also be aware that in most major businesses, that's the extent of salespeople's jobs. They sell you the product. They're not actually involved in manufacturing the product or assessing the product or ensuring that the product actually lives up to every single thing that they're selling you. And you better believe that a salesperson is going to highlight the best features of a product and minimize the parts of the product that aren't as good. Now I want you to imagine college coaches. If you are the head coach of a college program, you are not only the sales wing of the business, you are also the manufacturing and production wing of the business. You are the assessment wing of the business. You are every part of the business rolled into one. And you might have heard the phrases program or organization to describe what college coaches run. They don't just run teams. They run businesses, except they run every part of it. And one of the things that I've really learned with the help of some of the AAU coaches I've spoken to, some high school coaches I've spoken to, and some players I've spoken to, and again, some players that you will hear from in the near future, is that there are many coaches out there who are not as good at delivering the product as they are at selling the product. Similarly, there are actually some phenomenal coaches out there at delivering the product who are horrendous at sales. And the sales pitch part of this process is their least favorite part of it. And what we tend to see a lot of the time is recruits and parents see good salespeople, but good salespeople aren't always great coaches. And the specific thing that you need to be able to control for as you are navigating this process is the difference between the sale of the product and the product itself. If you continue listening to future podcasts, we're going to talk a lot about how you can better prepare yourself to assess the coaches when they're in sales mode, and then follow through and see how much of the sell is actually consistent to what they do day to day in practice. But for now, that is going to include watching practices, talking with players on the current team, trying to network with mentors who have experiences with former players that played for that coach. And you're going to want to make sure you check all those boxes before you really identify that specific experience with that coach as a good sell. And now part 3. These first 2 parts, by the way, are overwhelming enough. It's really overwhelming to do everything you need to do to try to get on a college coach's radar. It's really overwhelming when you have a couple of choices to really filter down and figure out which coach can actually deliver on the things that they say they're going to deliver on. But the last part, it's the unknown. And unfortunately, I'm not talking about something as fun as a Pixar movie. The unknown is that the landscape of college athletics is about to change in ways that no one, coaches, players, AAU coaches, no one has ever experienced before. In the last 5 years, the transfer portal has completely changed the way that college athletics works on a year-to-year basis. Coaches are no longer just recruiting to build and develop over the course of 4 years. To give you some crazy data, in each of the last 4 seasons, 20% of men's and women's Division I basketball was in the transfer portal. 20%. That's 1 in 5 hoopers in the transfer portal. So that means this experience has not been working out for one reason or another for 20% of the college basketball populace. But if you're a college coach and you have the opportunity to land a transfer who already has the experience with college athletics, based on some of the things we've previously talked about, it's in their best interest, the higher you go, to start pulling more from the transfer pool and less from the high school recruiting pool. And if you do the fast math, 20% of each side's in the portal, about 50% of that 20% land at another scholarship level. The rest either stop playing or trickle down to the non-scholarship level. And I can identify dozens of non-scholarship teams that brought in scholarship level transfers as opposed to high school aged first year athletes. We extrapolate that math a little bit further, and we get about 10 to 12% fewer college basketball players are being recruited out of high school over the last 5 years. So not only is this changing the landscape, but it's requiring you to be not only better at your sport, but better at showcasing the growth of your skills and your attitude as a high school athlete. This is the hardest time it's ever been to get recruited to be a college athlete because of the portal. And that is not the only thing that is changing. The NIL landscape is changing rapidly. And even as players are now allowed to make money off of their name, image, and likeness, there are also multiple cases in federal and Supreme Courts that are about to be settled, literally as we speak, that could completely change the compensatory model of athletes that are at institutions big enough to generate revenue from those athletes. A lot of schools, even at the scholarship level, operate out of an expenditure, just like an old school business expense would if you were running a regular company. But the rules are going to be based on the Power Five. And whatever is about to happen at the Power Five is going to completely shock the college sports landscape all the way down to Division III. So it's really important to me as someone that is providing this information, again, with that journalism lens at heart. It's really, really important to me that we stay on the cutting edge of this stuff. So not only are we going to be interviewing college coaches and former college athletes, we're also going to be interviewing a lot of figures that run in lanes adjacent to college athletics that can help forecast what is coming next so that you can stay ahead of it. On the subject of all of that transferring and all of that change, you better believe that as more money gets involved, consequences shift the priorities of higher level coaches. So when we talk about transferring and the transfer portal, it's really important to me that you know right off the bat that most of the people I spoke to did not simply just transfer because they either wanted NIL money or because they wanted more playing time. Most of the people that I've spoken to, including some people you're going to meet on this podcast, transferred because they wanted to have better relationships with their teammates and better relationships with their coaches. So as the human experience is sort of getting removed and it's more money involved and more transactional, there's this new generation of athletes that are like, man, I'm not really even enjoying this anymore. I want to love my sport and I want to love who I'm playing my sport with. And that is what is driving a lot of change. And I'm so excited for you to meet some of these people because it's going to be so much more effective and impactful for you to hear it from them instead of from me. So we have all of these challenges. And with all of these negatives, why am I even here? Why am I even talking to you about these things? It's because I love it. I love college athletics so much. College basketball is my favorite thing ever. I'm obsessed with watching it. Even in the off season, I break down film. I'm a huge dork about it. Coaching college basketball, I can't imagine ever having a job that I will love as much as I loved coaching college basketball. It was the best. Why? Because you're constantly surrounded by people, both professionals and students, that are in love with the process of growing every day and being part of a team and leading one another and inspiring one another to continue growing every single day. I want as many young people as possible to have that experience. There is tons of actual empirical data that student athletes in college end up showcasing better on resumes, getting better jobs, and making more money than non-athletes. And I think that makes a lot of people resentful. But once you've seen it from my side, I'm not resentful. I totally get it. These are people that are more accountable. These are people that manage their time better. These are people that are confident in their ability to make very difficult decisions and live with the consequences. That is the real sauce that comes with being a college athlete. It's not your ability to potentially go to the pros. That's not it. It's your ability to grow in every element of your persona so that in your next challenges in life, a relationship partner, an entrepreneur, a civil servant, a parent, you are more ready to go because you were a college athlete. And in order to be ready to go, you're going to specifically need to have 4 characteristics. And I want to close with this section because these 4 characteristics are what, to me, stood out as most important in my research. College coaches, most of them at least, the good ones, don't just coach their sport because they like the sport. They coach the sport because they're invested in growing specific things about you. Here are those 4 things. They want you to be growth oriented. They want you to just love the process of getting better every day. And they want you to view failure, instead of something that just bogs you down and makes you sad, as an opportunity to get better and something to learn from. They want to teach you how to engage. How do you keep your eyes up, make confident but not arrogant eye contact, firm handshakes, really making sure that when you're one-on-one with somebody, they have you, 100% of you. How do you engage with somebody? Now, some of those lessons are taught on the court by you being more locked in and attentive to detail. But the most important lessons are actually some of the things you'll be doing off the court as you grow closer with your team and your community at the next level. Then you need to be more aware. Your self-awareness is mission critical to this process, not only at the high school level, because your self-awareness will ultimately drive you towards finding the best fit for yourself. But once you get to college, self-awareness is mission critical because that's what allows you to be coached. What are the things that you're great at? What are the things that you need to get better at? What is your actual role in your highest aspiration on this team? And then finally, they need you to be ready for anything. Things change in the snap of the fingers at the collegiate level. Schedules change, positions change. Somebody gets hurt, next player up. That change that rapidly as it happens at the collegiate level can really be anxiety inducing. But if you get confident enough in your own growth, if you get confident enough in your ability to engage, and if you are really keenly aware of your identity and your role, then you become ready. And the people that experience the most success at the collegiate level are the people that are ready for anything. So from this point forward, this is what you can expect to be ready for when it comes to nail the recruiting process and specifically this podcast. You're going to always be learning about one of 3 key things. 1, what college coaches are actually looking for. 2, what you should be looking for as a recruit to find the right thing for yourself. And 3, your continued education on the wild changes that are sweeping college athletics. We need you to stay above the rising tide. And we're always going to focus on those 3 things by incorporating a component of gear. We're going to be talking to coaches that are going to teach you how to create a more engaging approach to the process and the game. We're also going to be hearing from people who love growth-oriented young people and cultivating that in people. We're going to hear from people that are going to teach you to be more aware, and we're certainly going to get you ready for the next steps. Each episode is going to tackle one of those 3 things with a deeply intentional focus on gear. The rest is up to you. And I will say the same thing to you to close out this podcast as I do to any client that I work with. The lane I am intentionally choosing to be in right now, while I cannot coach, is the lane that teaches you to fish. There will be no fish provisions on this podcast because ultimately, the more shortcuts you take and the more people you bring in to do things for you, the more shocked you are going to be when you actually arrive on a college campus and have to do it yourself. The real champions are going to be the ones that learn to fish and then build their discipline around fishing themselves. I am so excited for the fishing tactics that we are about to embark on. You're going to learn a lot if you stay tuned, and I cannot wait to help teach you all of it. In the interim, you can always find me on social media. I am at Nail the Recruiting Process on Instagram. You can follow me on Twitter and TikTok at Jared the Coach. Everything about me is Nail the Recruiting Process, though. It's my website. It's the name of the podcast. It's the name of the book. It's very intentionally a one-stop shop for everything about this journey. Thank you so much for your time, and I cannot wait to have you back for the next episodes when we start interviewing some of my favorite people in the athletics landscape. That's going to do it for another episode of the Nail the Recruiting Process podcast. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you got something out of today's podcast. If you'd like to learn more about anything related to Nail the Recruiting Process, the book, my work, maybe wanting to work with me one-on-one, anything under the sun, you're going to visit www.nailtherecruitingprocess.com. If you'd like to follow me on social media, you can follow me at Nail the Recruiting Process on Instagram or at Jared the Coach on Twitter and TikTok. Both of those handles are just one word, no characters, no spaces. If you'd like to ask something of me directly, if you'd like a question that maybe you want answered on a future podcast, or if you have an idea for something we should talk about in a future episode, please reach out to me via email. I would love to hear from you. My email address is recruitinggear@gmail.com. That's the word recruiting, then the word gear combined. recruitinggear@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope to catch you next time.